The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Windsor Castle, as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he thought would be another routine day of duty. 23 years he had served as a Queen's Guard, standing motionless for hours, enduring countless tourists who tried everything imaginable to make him break character. He had seen it all. People making funny faces, telling jokes, even pretending to faint right in front of him. Nothing could crack his stone-cold expression anymore. James took his position at the castle's main entrance, his bearskin hat perfectly aligned, his rifle held at the precise angle drilled into him during years of training. The early tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, hoping to capture that perfect shot of the famous unmoving guard. Children pointed and whispered, adults chuckled and posed beside him, but James remained a statue of discipline and duty. Around mid-morning, the crowd began to thicken. School groups arrived with excited children chattering loudly, their teachers trying to maintain order while explaining the history and importance of the Royal Guards. James had grown accustomed to the noise, the constant flash of cameras and the occasional attempt by brave souls to get a reaction from him. His training had prepared him for all of this. Among the crowd, he noticed a small family approaching, a middle-aged woman walking slowly with the help of a walking stick, accompanied by what appeared to be her elderly mother in a wheelchair. The older woman looked frail, wrapped in a thick blanket despite the mild weather. They moved carefully through the bustling crowd, the daughter gently pushing the wheelchair while trying to navigate around other tourists who seemed oblivious to their struggle. The family stopped about 10 feet away from James's post. The elderly woman in the wheelchair looked up at him with curious, tired eyes. Her daughter leaned down and whispered something in her ear, pointing toward James. The old woman nodded slowly, a small smile crossing her weathered face. They seemed different from the typical tourists, quieter, more respectful, observing rather than trying to create a spectacle. James maintained his rigid posture, but something about this family caught his attention in a way that surprised him. Perhaps it was the gentle way the daughter cared for her mother, or the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves despite the obvious challenges they faced moving through the crowded space. After years of dealing with loud, demanding tourists, their respectful presence felt like a breath of fresh air. The daughter began taking photos, but not the usual silly poses or attempts to distract the guard. Instead, she carefully positioned herself to capture her mother's face alongside the impressive figure of the Royal Guard, creating what seemed to be meaningful memories rather than just another tourist snapshot. The elderly woman's eyes sparkled with genuine interest and respect as she gazed at James, clearly understanding the honor and tradition he represented. As the minutes passed, more tourists pushed around the small family, some bumping into the wheelchair without apology, others cutting in front of them to get their own photos. James watched from the corner of his eye as the daughter struggled to protect her mother, while still trying to enjoy their visit. The elderly woman never complained, but James could see her becoming overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding them. Other guards had warned James about getting emotionally involved with tourists, reminding him that his job was to remain impartial and unmoved, regardless of what happened around him. Yet something about watching this vulnerable family navigate the thoughtless crowd stirred feelings he had learned to suppress during his years of service. The contrast between their quiet dignity and the loud, demanding behavior of other visitors made their presence even more noticeable. The morning continued with its usual rhythm of tourist groups coming and going, but James found himself increasingly aware of the small family who had chosen to stay nearby. They weren't causing any disruption or trying to get his attention. They simply seemed content to be in the presence of such an important historical tradition. Their respectful behavior stood out dramatically, against the backdrop of tourists who treated the guards more like entertainment than dedicated servants of the crown. As the sun climbed higher and the crowds grew larger, James noticed the elderly woman beginning to look more tired. The combination of the warming day, the increasing noise, and the constant jostling from other tourists was clearly taking its toll on her. Her daughter kept checking on her, adjusting her blanket, offering water, and asking quietly if she wanted to leave. But the old woman seemed determined to stay, fascinated by the ceremony and tradition unfolding before her eyes. Little did James know that within the next few hours, this seemingly ordinary encounter would transform into something that would challenge everything he had been taught about his role as a royal guard. and ultimately reveal the true meaning of duty and compassion in ways he never could have imagined. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as the tourist crowds reached their peak. James felt the familiar discomfort of his heavy wool uniform and the weight of his bearskin hat. But his training kept him perfectly still despite the rising temperature. The elderly woman and her daughter remained nearby, having found a small spot of shade where they could rest while still observing the changing of the guard ceremony that would happen later. James noticed that several tourists had become increasingly aggressive in their attempts to get reactions from him. A group of teenagers took turns making loud noises, waving their hands inches from his face and even dropping items near his feet hoping he would flinch. Their behavior was becoming more disruptive, and other visitors were starting to complain about their antics. Through it all, James remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, giving no indication that he was even aware of their presence. The elderly woman watched these interactions with growing concern. James could see her shaking her head disapprovingly at the teenagers' behavior, and at one point she said something to her daughter that made them both look sad. It was clear that she understood the dignity and respect that the Royal Guard position deserved, and she was disturbed by the way others were treating James as if he were merely a tourist attraction, rather than a dedicated soldier. Around 2 in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. The elderly woman began to struggle with her breathing. Her daughter immediately noticed and quickly moved to her side, checking her pulse and asking if she was okay. The old woman tried to wave away her daughter's concerns, but it was obvious she was having difficulty. Her face had grown pale, and she was gripping the arms of her wheelchair tightly. The daughter began looking around frantically for help, but the crowd was thick and noisy, and most people were too focused on their own activities to notice the medical emergency developing right in front of them. She tried to flag down other tourists, but they either didn't understand what was happening or were too busy taking photos to pay attention. The situation was becoming more serious by the minute. James watched this unfold with growing alarm. His training explicitly forbade him from breaking character or leaving his post except in the most extreme circumstances. Royal Guards were taught that their duty to the crown superseded almost everything else, and that maintaining their position and composure was essential to the dignity of their role. Breaking protocol could result in serious disciplinary action, including dismissal from the prestigious position he had worked so hard to achieve. But as he watched the elderly woman's condition worsen and saw her daughter's increasing desperation, James felt something deep inside him shift. This wasn't about protocol or rules anymore. This was about a human being in distress who needed help that no one else was providing. The other tourists continued to mill around, taking selfies and chatting loudly, completely oblivious to the crisis happening just feet away from them. The daughter was now crying softly as she tried to help her mother, who appeared to be having some kind of breathing episode or possibly a panic attack brought on by the heat and crowds. The old woman's eyes found James's face, and for just a moment their gazes met. In that instant, he saw not just a tourist, but a grandmother, someone's beloved mother, a person who had lived through decades of history and deserved to be treated with dignity and care. James felt his resolve wavering as he watched the daughter pull out her phone, probably trying to call for emergency services. But he knew that in this crowded area, it would take time for help to arrive, and even longer for emergency responders to locate them among the hundreds of tourists scattered throughout the castle grounds. The woman needed immediate assistance, and there was someone right there who could provide it, if only he was willing to break the rules that had governed his entire military career. The internal struggle was intense. On one side was his oath of service, his commitment to duty, and the knowledge that breaking protocol could end his career. On the other side was a fellow human being in distress, a situation where his action or inaction could make the difference between life and death. He thought about his own grandmother, who had passed away several years earlier, and how he would have wanted someone to help her if she had been in a similar situation. The teenagers who had been harassing him earlier noticed the commotion and began to gather around, but instead of offering help, they started taking photos and videos of the distressed woman, treating her medical emergency as entertainment. This callous behavior from other visitors made James's decision even clearer. If no one else was going to step up and show basic human decency, then perhaps it was time for him to remember that being a protector of the realm meant protecting all people, not just following rigid rules. As the elderly woman's breathing became more labored and her daughter's cries for help became more desperate, James realized that this moment would define not just his career, but his character as a human being. The choice he was about to make would cross every line he had been trained never to cross, but sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules, even when the consequences could be severe. Without warning, James did something that shocked everyone around him. He broke position. The crowd gasped audibly as the seemingly immovable royal guard suddenly stepped forward, his rifle moving from its rigid position as he approached the distressed elderly woman and her panicked daughter. Tourists stopped taking photos. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and even the rowdy teenagers fell silent as they witnessed something they had never seen before: a Queen's Guard abandoning his post. James knelt down beside the wheelchair, his red tunic and tall bearskin hat making him an imposing but oddly comforting presence. His voice was gentle but firm as he addressed the elderly woman. "Ma'am, I'm here to help. Can you tell me what's wrong?" The contrast between his formal appearance and his caring tone created a surreal but deeply moving scene that no one present would ever forget. The daughter looked up at James with a mixture of gratitude and amazement, tears streaming down her face. "She has a heart condition," she explained quickly. "I think the heat and crowds are making it worse. She's having trouble breathing and her medication is back at the hotel. I don't know what to do." Her voice shook, with fear and exhaustion from trying to handle the situation alone. James immediately took charge of the situation with the same efficiency and precision he brought to his military duties. He turned to the crowd that had gathered and spoke with authority. "I need everyone to step back and give us space. Someone call emergency services immediately. Tell them we have a cardiac episode at Windsor, Castle main entrance." His commanding presence caused the previously chaotic crowd to organize themselves and follow his instructions without question. He then turned his attention back to the elderly woman, whose name he learned was Margaret. Speaking in calm, reassuring tones, James helped position her more comfortably in her wheelchair and began basic first aid techniques he had learned during his military training. He checked her pulse, monitored her breathing, and kept her talking to ensure she remained conscious and alert while they waited for professional medical help to arrive. The daughter, whose name was Sarah, watched in amazement as this stranger, a man who moments before had seemed like a statue, transformed into her mother's guardian angel. James continued to reassure Margaret, telling her about his own grandmother and sharing gentle stories to keep her distracted from her distress. His presence alone seemed to calm her, and her breathing began to stabilize slightly. Other tourists began to step forward to help, inspired by James's example. Someone brought water, another person created a makeshift shade with their jacket, and several people formed a protective circle around Margaret to keep the curious onlookers at a respectful distance. What had started as a crowd of self-absorbed sightseers had transformed into a community of caring individuals, all because one person had chosen to break the rules to do what was right. Within minutes, other royal guards arrived at the scene, having been alerted by the commotion. James expected immediate reprimand, possibly even arrest for abandoning his post and breaking protocol. Instead, he found support from his fellow guards, who quickly assessed the situation and radioed for additional medical assistance while helping to maintain order and privacy for Margaret and her family. The senior guard, Sergeant Major Thompson, approached James as the paramedics finally arrived. James prepared himself for the worst: a public dressing down, immediate removal from duty, and the end of his military career. Instead, Thompson placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Well done, Mitchell. This is what being a guard really means: protecting those who need protection." As the paramedics took over Margaret's care, checking her vital signs and preparing to transport her to the hospital for evaluation, she reached out and grasped James's hand. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you for remembering that you're human first, soldier second. My late husband served in the war, and he would have been so proud to see what you did today." Sarah hugged James tightly, sobbing with relief and gratitude. "You saved my mother's life," she said. "I will never forget what you did for us. You didn't just help her medically. You showed her that there are still good people in the world who care about others more than rules and regulations." The crowd, which had initially gasped in shock at seeing a royal guard break protocol, now began to applaud. The teenagers who had earlier been trying to harass James were among the loudest supporters, having witnessed firsthand the difference between duty for show and duty for substance. Many people were taking photos and videos, but now they were capturing something truly meaningful, a moment when humanity triumphed over regulation. As Margaret was carefully loaded into the ambulance, she insisted on taking one last photo with James. Despite being hooked up to oxygen and monitoring equipment, she smiled brightly as Sarah captured the image of her mother with the Royal Guard, who had chosen to risk his career to help her. It was a picture that would later become famous, but in that moment, it was simply a grandmother's way of saying thank you to someone who had shown her kindness when she needed it most. The ambulance disappeared into the London traffic, carrying Margaret to the nearest hospital while James stood watching until it was completely out of sight. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but many tourists lingered, approaching James to express their admiration for what he had done. Children who had earlier been trying to make him laugh now looked at him with genuine respect and awe, understanding that they had witnessed something special. Sarah had chosen to ride with her mother in the ambulance, but not before pressing a piece of paper into James's hand with their hotel information, begging him to stay in touch so they could properly thank him once Margaret was stable. James tucked the paper into his uniform pocket, knowing that this encounter had changed something fundamental about how he viewed his role as a protector. Sergeant Major Thompson approached James as the crowd thinned out. Instead of the reprimand James expected, Thompson's expression was thoughtful and respectful. "Mitchell, in 30 years of service, I've never seen anything quite like what just happened here," he said. "Technically, you violated protocol by leaving your post, but sometimes the spirit of the law matters more than the letter of the law." James braced himself, still uncertain about the consequences he would face. "Sir, I understand I broke regulation, but I couldn't just stand there and watch that woman suffer when I had the ability to help her. She reminded me of my own grandmother, and I kept thinking about what I would want someone to do if it were my family member in distress." Thompson nodded slowly, his weathered face showing understanding rather than disappointment. "That's exactly what I hoped you would say, Mitchell. The Royal Guard exists to serve and protect, and that's precisely what you did today. Yes, we have protocols and procedures, but they exist to serve a greater purpose. The protection and service of the people. You never forgot that greater purpose." Over the next few hours, word of James's actions spread rapidly throughout the Royal Guard regiment. Fellow guards approached him with respect and admiration, sharing their own stories of times when they had struggled with the balance between following orders and following their conscience. Many admitted that they had been in similar situations where they wanted to help, but had been too afraid of the consequences to act. The story didn't stay contained within the military community for long. Several tourists had captured the entire incident on their phones and social media, and by evening, videos of James breaking protocol to help Margaret were spreading across the internet. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly James found himself at the center of a media storm he had never anticipated. The initial reaction from the public was overwhelmingly positive. Comments flooded social media praising James for his humanity and compassion, with many people sharing their own stories of times when they had needed help from strangers. The hashtag #SavedByTheGuard began trending, and people from around the world were sharing the videos and expressing their admiration for James's actions. But not all reactions were positive. Some traditionalists criticized James for breaking protocol, arguing that Royal Guards should maintain their positions regardless of circumstances, and that making exceptions would undermine the discipline and reliability that made the institution respected worldwide. Conservative military blogs published articles questioning whether James's actions set a dangerous precedent that could lead to guards abandoning their posts for less serious reasons. The criticism stung, but it was vastly overshadowed by the support James received from unexpected sources. Veterans organizations praised him for remembering that military service is ultimately about protecting people, not just following orders. Medical professionals commended his quick thinking and proper first aid response. Even some members of Parliament spoke publicly about the incident, using it as an example of the kind of public service that makes Britain proud. 3 days after the incident, James received a call that would change everything. Sarah was on the line, calling from the hospital where Margaret was recovering. "James, I have wonderful news. Mum is doing much better. The doctors say your quick response and keeping her calm likely prevented her condition from becoming much more serious. But that's not why I'm calling. We've been contacted by several news organizations, and there's someone very important who wants to meet you." James was puzzled by the cryptic nature of Sarah's call, but he agreed to visit Margaret at the hospital during his off-duty hours. When he arrived at the cardiac unit still wearing his civilian clothes, he was surprised to find Margaret sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better, surrounded by flowers and cards from well-wishers who had heard about the incident. Margaret's face lit up when she saw James enter the room. "There's my guardian angel," she said warmly, reaching out to take his hand. "I have been telling everyone about the brave soldier who saved my life, but more importantly, I've been telling them about the kind man who remembered that duty means caring for people." Sarah stood beside her mother's bed, holding an official-looking letter. "James, after the story went public, we received this. It's from Buckingham Palace. Someone very high up in the royal household has been following the story, and they want to meet with you personally to discuss what happened." She handed him the letter with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. James opened the letter with trembling hands, reading the formal but warm invitation to attend a private meeting at Buckingham Palace to discuss his actions and their impact on the reputation of the Royal Guard. The letter was signed by a senior palace official and indicated that his actions had been noted at the highest levels of the royal establishment. A week later, James found himself walking through the grand corridors of Buckingham Palace, escorted by a palace official who had been remarkably tight-lipped about the purpose of the meeting. His dress uniform had been pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his medals arranged precisely according to regulation. Despite his years of service, he had never been inside the palace itself, and the experience was both intimidating and awe-inspiring. They passed through rooms filled with priceless artwork, elaborate tapestries, and centuries of British history displayed in every corner. James tried to maintain his military composure, but the grandeur of his surroundings made him acutely aware of how extraordinary this situation had become. A simple act of human kindness had led him to the very heart of the monarchy he had sworn to protect. The palace official stopped before an ornate door and knocked gently before opening it. "Sergeant Mitchell, Your Royal Highness," he announced formally before stepping aside to allow James to enter. James's heart nearly stopped as he realized he was being presented to a member of the royal family, someone whose identity he had been kept in suspense about until this very moment. The room was smaller and more intimate than James had expected, furnished with comfortable chairs and family photographs that made it feel more like a private study than a formal reception room. Standing near the window looking out at the palace gardens was a figure James recognized immediately from countless official portraits and ceremonies. When the royal turned to face him, James snapped to attention and performed the most perfect salute of his military career. "Please, Sergeant Mitchell, sit down," came the warm, familiar voice. "I've been very much looking forward to this conversation." James remained standing until specifically directed to sit, his military training taking over despite the surprisingly informal tone of the meeting. "I must say your actions last week have created quite a stir, haven't they?" James wasn't sure how to respond to such a direct question from royalty, so he opted for honesty. "Your Royal Highness, I simply did what I felt was right in the moment. I never intended for it to become such a public matter, and I certainly never expected it to reach your attention." His voice was steady, but inside he was still processing the surreal nature of the situation. The royal smiled genuinely, settling into a chair across from James. "That's precisely why it has reached my attention, Sergeant. You acted from instinct and compassion, not for recognition or publicity. Do you know that I've received over 5,000 letters and emails about your actions? People from around the world have written to express their admiration for what you did, and more importantly, for what it represents about British values." James listened intently as the royal continued, explaining that the incident had sparked conversations about the role of tradition versus humanity, about when rules should be flexible, and about what true service means. "You've helped people remember that our institutions exist to serve people, not the other way around. The Guard has always been about protection and service, but sometimes we can become so focused on ceremony that we forget the substance." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with James sharing more details about his decision-making process that day, his concerns about breaking protocol, and his surprise at the public reaction. The royal listened thoughtfully, asking insightful questions about military training, the balance between duty and discretion, and James's thoughts on how the incident might influence guard protocols in the future. Near the end of their meeting, the royal stood and walked to a desk, retrieving a small box. "Sergeant Mitchell, it is my pleasure to present you with a special commendation for exceptional service. This recognition is not for breaking protocol, but for remembering that the highest protocol of all is caring for those who need our protection." James accepted the commendation with gratitude and honor, feeling the weight of both the physical award and its symbolic meaning. "There is one more thing," the royal continued with a smile. "I understand that Mrs. Margaret has made a full recovery and is planning to return home to Scotland next week. I have arranged for you to have leave time to visit her properly, and I believe she has some family members who would very much like to meet the man who helped their mother." As James prepared to leave, the royal offered one final thought. "What you did that day reminded us all that the greatest traditions are those that put human dignity first. You didn't break the rules, Sergeant Mitchell. You fulfilled them in their truest sense." The meeting concluded with a handshake that James would remember for the rest of his life, and he left the palace feeling not just honored, but validated in his decision to choose compassion over protocol. The news of James's royal recognition spread quickly, further cementing his status as a symbol of the balance between duty and humanity. Military academies began using his story as a case study in ethical decision-making, and tourist guides at Windsor Castle now regularly shared the tale of the guard who broke rank to save a life, turning James's moment of choice into a permanent part of the castle's living history. The impact extended beyond James himself. The Royal Guard Regiment began reviewing their protocols, creating official guidelines for when guards could break position in emergency situations. James found himself involved in these discussions, helping to craft policies that would allow future guards to act with both authority and compassion when civilian lives were at stake. 6 months later, James received an invitation that brought tears to his eyes. Margaret and Sarah were hosting a small celebration in Scotland to mark Margaret's 80th birthday, and they specifically requested that James be there to help celebrate the life he had helped preserve. The invitation was handwritten in Margaret's careful script, expressing how much his presence would mean to the entire family. James used his accumulated leave time to travel to Scotland, where he discovered that Margaret's family was much larger than he had realized during that hectic day at Windsor Castle. Children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and extended family members had gathered from across the United Kingdom to celebrate not just Margaret's birthday, but also to meet the man who had become something of a family legend. The celebration was held in Margaret's garden, a beautiful space filled with flowers she had tended for over 50 years. As James arrived, he was greeted with enthusiastic applause from 3 generations of Margaret's family, each of whom had heard the story countless times and wanted to personally thank him. Children who had been taught about the incident in school proudly showed James their drawings of royal guards, while teenagers peppered him with questions about military life and service. Margaret herself had made a remarkable recovery, though she still moved slowly and relied on her walking stick for support. When she saw James approaching through the garden gate, her face radiated pure joy. "My dear boy," she said, embracing him warmly, "you look wonderful in civilian clothes. I'm so glad you could come celebrate with us." During the celebration, James learned more about Margaret's remarkable life. She had been a nurse during World War II, working in London hospitals during the Blitz and caring for wounded soldiers throughout the war. Her late husband had served in the Royal Navy, and together they had raised 4 children while Margaret continued her nursing career. She had spent her entire life caring for others, which made James's decision to help her feel even more meaningful. Sarah pulled James aside during the party to share something that moved him deeply. After the incident at Windsor Castle, Mum started a small foundation using the donations people sent after hearing her story. She's been using the money to help other elderly people who need medical assistance but can't afford it. Your act of kindness has rippled out to help dozens of other families. The foundation, called the Guardian Angel Fund, had already assisted several families with medical expenses, transportation to hospitals, and support for caregivers. Margaret had insisted on naming it after James, though she playfully referred to all the recipients as her guardian angels, people who helped others without expecting recognition or reward. As the evening wound down and family members began to say their goodbyes, Margaret asked James to walk with her through her garden. They moved slowly among the roses and lavender, talking about life, service, and the unexpected ways that single moments can change everything. "You know," Margaret said softly, "that day at the castle I was feeling quite sorry for myself. The crowds, the heat, my health problems, I was ready to give up and go home." She paused beside a particularly beautiful rose bush, touching one of the blooms gently. "But when I saw you break away from your post to help me, something changed inside me. I realized that there are still people in this world who put kindness ahead of convenience, who choose to help rather than look away. You gave me back my faith in humanity, James. That's worth more than any medical treatment." James felt overwhelmed by her words, understanding for the first time the full impact of his decision that day. "Margaret, you've taught me something just as important. You showed me that sometimes the most important duty we have is simply being human. I thought I was just helping someone in distress, but you've helped me understand that I was actually fulfilling my oath in the truest way possible." As James prepared to return to London, Margaret presented him with a small gift. A framed photograph of her late husband in his Royal Navy uniform, along with a letter he had written to her during the war. "He wrote this during the Battle of the Atlantic," she explained. "He said that the most important thing he learned in service was that protecting people means protecting their dignity, their hope, and their humanity. I think you understand that now." The letter's words resonated deeply with James. The uniform we wear means nothing if we forget why we wear it. We serve not because we love war, but because we love peace. We fight not because we enjoy conflict, but because we cherish the innocent lives that depend on our protection. Never let the ceremony overshadow the substance of why we serve. James returned to his duties at Windsor Castle with a transformed understanding of his role. He still maintained the same discipline and precision that had always defined his service, but now he carried with him the knowledge that true strength comes from knowing when to bend without breaking, when to choose compassion over regulation, and when to remember that behind every uniform is a human heart capable of extraordinary kindness. The story of the Royal Guard who crossed the line became more than just a news story. It became a reminder that the greatest acts of courage often involve not following orders, but following conscience. James continued his service with the same dedication as before, but now he understood that protecting the realm meant protecting all the people in it, one act of human kindness at a time. Years later, when James finally retired from the Royal Guard, he carried with him not just military honors and commendations, but the knowledge that he had made a difference in the world by choosing to be human first and a soldier second. Margaret's garden continued to bloom each year, a living testament to the idea that kindness, like flowers, grows most beautiful when it's tended with care and allowed to spread naturally from heart to heart.